David, thank you again for being here with us today. Look forward to hearing about the work going on in Oregon. And for folks that aren't familiar with David, David Alloway is a senior policy analyst at Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Materials Management Program. He coordinates a variety of projects related to materials, including waste management within the state, covering sustainable production and consumption, greenhouse gases, and life cycle analysis. In 2010, David helped to staff the Oregon Global Warming Commission's Roadmap to 2020 project. He also led efforts to develop and update Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and he contributed to ICLEI US greenhouse gas accounting protocols for communities and recycling, and led the sustainable production and consumption elements of Oregon's 2050 vision. Before joining DEQ in 2000, David worked for 11 years in the solid waste consulting industry. He's a native of Oregon and has a BA in physics from Charlton College in Minnesota. David, thanks again for being with us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Andy, and good morning to all of you. Thanks for taking time out of your schedules to hear what another state is doing, and I really look forward to some productive conversation. I often look to the Northeast for inspiration and look forward to talking with you more about your programs. So, as Andy said, I've organized my presentation today into 3 segments. In the first, it's a bit of an introduction just to get us all on the same page about what sustainable materials management is, and tell you the story about why we're transitioning away from solid waste and into SMM. We'll take a pause for questions and discussion, and then we'll go into the second segment, which describes how Oregon is undertaking this transition, starting with a planning effort and some enabling legislation, and then again, some time for discussion. And then I'll give you a flavor of what we're doing that is new or different as a result of this shift to sustainable materials management. And then we'll have time for more discussion at the end. So just to get us all on the same page, what is materials management? EPA provides us with not one, but 2 different definitions. But basically, the common themes here are about a whole life cycle approach to materials, including but not limited to solid waste, minimizing materials used, and all environmental impacts, not only the impacts of waste. So sustainable materials management truly takes a life cycle view of materials, beginning with resource extraction and going through the life cycle, which you're all familiar with. That green arrow there of end-of-life management, recycling and recovery and disposal has been the bread and butter, or maybe the entire menu for most of our programs for decades. It's where we've done almost all of our work. But sustainable materials management calls on us to broaden our perspective and address impacts and actions across the entire life cycle of materials, including, but not limited to, end-of-life management. So I'm going to provide you just some quick examples here of what I mean by impacts across the life cycle as well as actions. Recycling, and specifically the act of collecting recyclables, uses fuel. And some cities, none in Oregon and hopefully none in your states, but in some other parts of the country, have justified discontinuing curbside recycling service under the claim that having an extra fleet of vehicles uses fuel, uses energy, and contributes to greenhouse gases. Now, if your view of the world is a very, very narrow view that only looks at end-of-life management, then that is true. Collecting recyclables, curbside or in any other means, frankly, does require more fuel and results in more transportation-related emissions. However, that's not the whole story. And sustainable materials management says we should look at impacts across the full life cycle. And when we do, in an analysis we conducted for the city of Portland, we found that for every unit of energy required to collect recyclables curbside resulted in 20 units of energy saved when those recyclables got past the MRFs and into primary industries who use them in lieu of virgin resources. steel mills, plastics manufacturers, aluminum smelters, etc. So curbside recycling is a fantastic investment in energy conservation. It's like putting $1 in the bank and getting $20 back, but you don't appreciate this unless you look at impacts across the full life cycle. So that's what I mean by impacts. As an example of actions across the life cycle, I want to share with you some simplified results from a LCA, a life cycle assessment we commissioned a few years ago that looked at different methods of delivering drinking water. We had about 10 different impact categories. I've only put 5 on the slide here so that they fit. And in the blue, what I'm showing is the relative impact potential defined as the baseline for a single-use conventional PET water bottle recycled at a rate of 37%, which is the rate at which single-use water bottles were recycled in Oregon before they were added to our bottle bill a few years ago. In red are the environmental impacts for the same package used in the same way but recycled at a rate of 62%, which is the rate at which they were recycled after they were added to Oregon's bottle bill. So you can see that increasing recycling reduces the environmental impacts slightly, perhaps moderately, although not by a huge amount. And if more recycling is all we can do, if that's the only tool or the best tool in our toolbox, it's really limiting, and we're not going to achieve the deep reductions in environmental impacts that most in the scientific community are recommending we aim for. Fortunately, there are other actions upstream in the life cycle that can reduce impacts further. For example, producers of packaged drinking water can make their bottles thinner. This is an example of lightweighting or waste prevention. And since we've done our study, in fact, most producers have made their bottles much thinner, and that reduces the environmental impacts by a larger amount, as shown here in green. Consumers can also take an action, and that action is to drink from the tap. In aqua, here, I show the relative environmental impacts of what we call the worst case tap water scenario. And this involves a consumer who drinks tap water in a reusable bottle and washes that bottle every single day in the brand or model of home dishwasher, which by the greatest margin ever failed to qualify for the EPA Energy Star program. So this is the worst energy and water consuming dishwasher that has been legally sold in the United States in the last 20 plus years. And if you wash your reusable bottle every single day in this energy hog of a dishwasher, you get the impacts shown in aqua. If you wash your reusable bottle once a week in an Energy Star compliant dishwasher, the relative environmental impacts are shown there in orange. And you have to look very carefully to see them. Hopefully you can see them. They're almost zero. And the point of this is to illustrate is that while recycling is beneficial, it is of limited benefit. And there are other actions elsewhere in the life cycle, both that producers and consumers can take, that may have orders of magnitude greater environmental benefit. So sustainable materials management calls on us to look at impacts and actions across the whole life cycle. This slide is borrowed from the US EPA. Materials management is recommended as a means to answer complex questions about choices and impact. Questions such as, which products do we buy? What are they made of? How do we use them? And what do we do with stuff when we're done with it? All of these choices have environmental consequences that are not limited to solid waste. The solid waste impacts are the most visible and perhaps have the most emotional resonance with the public. But when you quantify them, they are definitely not the most impactful. So materials management has a multi-attribute approach, recommending instead of focusing on single attributes such as recyclable or biodegradable, to actually look at the environmental impacts. And it also offers interrelated solutions that deals with more than just solid waste, for example, air and water programs. So as an example of the limitations of focusing just on solid waste, I want to share a couple of examples here. First, to demonstrate that solid waste is not the same as overall environmental impact. We commissioned an LCA a few years ago that looked at different methods of designing and constructing homes. And in this slide here, I'm showing the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the 70-year life cycle of an average Oregon single-family home. And these are all different alternative wall framing techniques compared to standard wall framing. And what I want to point out here is that the 4 wall framing options that result in the greatest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle of the home, this is the materials and the energy used while the home is being occupied, are all wall framing designs that use more material, that generate more solid waste, and which in 3 of these 4 cases are very difficult to recover. So they're not materials or framing techniques that a narrow solid waste perspective would lead us to, but if your goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they would be very attractive. Many of you are familiar with an analysis the EPA conducted a few years ago called the systems approach to greenhouse gas inventories. EPA took the nation's greenhouse gas emissions and recategorized them according to economic systems and showed that the emissions associated with producing, transporting, and disposing of materials contribute 42% to our nation's emissions, more than buildings, more than transporting people, more than appliances, a very significant contributor to our nation's emissions. What if we could achieve the nirvana of zero solid waste and recycle or compost almost everything? How much would we reduce these emissions? We'd reduce the emissions by roughly 6%, or about 1/7 of the emissions associated with these materials. That would be very, very significant, and I don't want to suggest it's not worth aiming for deep emissions reductions like that. But what I want to point out is it's still a very limiting approach, and it leaves most of the emissions associated with materials on the table untouched. The traditional solid waste-centric view of the world also leads a lot of organizations to focus on single attributes. There's this misguided belief that since more recycling is better for the environment than less recycling, products with more recycled content are inherently better with products with less recycled content. And again, the science is much more nuanced. There are many examples of how this doesn't always hold up. And here's one from our current work where we're evaluating the carbon footprint of concrete. Public works departments sometimes specify that they want concrete that has high levels of recycled content. Well, concrete, of course, is a mix of cement, sand, crushed rock, and water. And the easiest way to get the most recycled content is to use crushed aggregate in lieu of mined rock. Here then is the carbon footprint for a fixed amount of concrete that has 44% recycled content by mass. This is using recycled aggregate, recycled concrete in lieu of crushed rock. But the carbon footprint of concrete isn't really dominated by the mass of crushed rock, but rather by the relatively small amounts of cement. And replacing that cement with other materials, such as slag or coal ash, can significantly drive down greenhouse gas emissions, as shown here. Even though the second mix has only 8% recycled content, and that's steel slag replacing some of the cement, its carbon footprint is much lower. Similarly, just because an item is easy to recycle doesn't mean that it is inherently an eco-groovy choice. Here's an example provided by the US EPA of 3 different options for packaging instant coffee: a steel can, a plastic tub, or a flexible pouch. The steel can and the plastic tub are readily recyclable in many communities across the US. The flexible pouch is not. But whether you care about reducing energy use, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or very narrowly just reducing solid waste, the non-recyclable flexible pouch appears to be the winner. So in short, our transition from solid waste to materials management is motivated by a desire as a state government to use our limited public resources to do the most good for the environment writ large. While the solid waste frame is emotionally powerful, it strategically limits us, and it limits our ability to work effectively with businesses and consumers. Materials management and its broader view, which includes solid waste but isn't limited to solid waste, allows us to look at problems from multiple perspectives, and it expands the number and the scope of actions we can take. In other words, we believe we can achieve greater public benefits in a more cost-effective way by taking a more holistic approach to reducing the environmental impacts of materials. So before I go into the Oregon story, we'll pause here if you have any questions.
Thanks, David. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the lines for folks. We've got 21 people on the webinar today. If you could, and you're not planning to ask a question, feel free to use your own audio controls to mute yourself. But we wanted to, the real point of asking David to join us here this morning is to, allow for some discussion among the folks on the line and really, consider what Oregon is doing, think about what's going on within your state, and share any reflections you have, obviously any questions you have for David, taking a deeper dive on some of the work they're doing. But we really want this to be kind of a dynamic session, so I hope you'll take advantage of that. Any questions for David or comments, thoughts?
Yes, this is Kathy Jameson from Vermont. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your information with us today. Small states like Vermont don't have the resources to do life cycle analysis, so making better choices based on the full life cycle analysis would be ideal, but where or how are we going to obtain that information for us to be able to make these well-informed decisions?
Hi, Kathy. Nice to hear from you. That's a really great question. Well, so LCA is difficult and expensive and time-consuming and not without controversy. It's certainly not for the faint of heart. However, the cost is coming down. The barriers to entry are coming down. The use is growing. It's becoming more widespread. And there are a number of different ways in which I think a state can engage with life cycle assessment. In a, I guess, ideal world, that involves the ability to conduct and commission your own LCAs. But if you can't, there are tools, not complete, but tools, for example, EPA's WARM tool, that can be used to answer some of these questions. You have peers, you can ask states like Oregon. We're happy to share information, and there are other organizations as well. Oregon is also a small state. We're not as small as Vermont, but we're not a whole lot bigger. And in the next segment, I will share with you how we obtained resources to hire a LCA practitioner. I don't know if what worked in Oregon will work in Vermont or could work in Vermont in the future, but we've come to the conclusion that having this foundational knowledge is important enough that it justifies investing resources in it, even if that means we have one less position to do more traditional work. So it is a shifting of priorities of sorts.
Great, thank you.
Other questions for David, comments, thoughts? No, David, this is Andy. I had one on the water bottle example. Are you asked for the data behind that as other states are deliberating their bottle bill expansions or shrinking their bottle bills?
I'm sorry, Andy, I didn't understand the question. Can you rephrase it?
Sure. The numbers that you shared on the bottle bill regarding before the water bottles were included under the bottle bill, and after there was a pretty sharp increase in recycling of water bottles. And I know this comes up a lot in discussions when states are looking to either expand or getting pressure to shrink or do away with their bottle bills. Do you get a lot of requests for that, for the data behind that study?
Well, the data behind the LCA study, no, although the study is unusually transparent. One of the things about the LCAs we've commissioned is we've put effort into making the studies unusually transparent and well documented, so it's possible people are just finding it online. As for the actual recovery rate and the, how much the rate increased, it's possible we're getting those questions. They're not coming to me, but I'm not our bottle bill staff. So I assume we're getting questions, but I don't know how many. Oregon's bottle bill, I'll mention, was expanded to include water bottles, oh gosh, I don't know, 8 or so years ago. Just this year, our redemption value went from 5 cents to 10 cents. And next year, our bottle bill will expand to include juices, teas, and sports drinks. So our program here has been expanding.
Thanks. And just a comment, it's a really great study in support of public water bottle filling stations. So thanks for doing that work.
Sure, thank you.
Other questions or comments before we move on? All righty.
All right. Well, we'll go into the second part here, which is how we went about this transition. So Oregon has a requirement in statute that the state periodically update its state solid waste management plan. The last plan had been written in 1994 and covered a 10-year period. And by 1990s standards, it was very progressive and very innovative. However, it made the mistake of assigning implementation responsibility primarily to a whole bunch of other organizations, none of which had the mandate or the resources to do much. And so this was a plan that was really a great document that gathered a lot of dust. Nevertheless, we had a statutory requirement to periodically update this plan, and it took us many years to get that update started. We were very, very thinly staffed. The motivation to replace the solid waste plan with a broader materials management plan was partially a consequence of our program's somewhat unusual history. So I have to give you a little bit of context. Among state solid waste programs, Oregon DEQ was one of the earlier adopters of life cycle assessment and life cycle thinking. And we had used it to a degree that many other states had not, and I'm thinking probably still have not. So we had some deeper knowledge of the impacts of materials from this life cycle perspective. And one of the reasons we had been an early adopter of it is that Oregon's legislature back in the year 2001 had looked at our system of state goals, which was a series of state recovery goals, and had added to those statewide waste generation goals in parallel with our recovery goals. And Oregon defines generation the way EPA does, so the only way generation goals could be achieved was through the reduce, reuse part of reduce, reuse, recycle. So that led us to make some investments in the early 2000s in prevention and reuse programs, a number of pilot projects, and some of those projects took us into the realm of consumption and production, because for prevention in particular, it really has very little to do with handling discards and managing wastes. It's about how materials are made, how businesses use materials, what consumers buy, how they use them. It's largely about consumption and production. And that early experience led us into life cycle analysis and thinking. And that, in turn, exposed to us how truly limiting the frame of solid waste management can be. So when it came time to update our state plan, there were several staff here that made a case that we ought to at least try a different approach. And this was consistent with and informed by what EPA was calling for in its 2009 call to action, Sustainable Materials Management, the Road Ahead. This is a really short and very powerful document, and if you haven't reviewed it, even though it's now, gosh, 8 years old, I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. Management here understood staff's recommendation and were willing to explore this idea, although none of us really knew where it would take us. So the point I want to make here is that this shift from solid waste to materials management was largely driven internally. It was not driven by external mandates or champions. Of course, external partners were very important and ultimately supportive, but this was really an internally driven change. So we looked around and we didn't find state plans that we felt really embodied the full life cycle sustainable materials management view. So we convened an advisory group of some of our state's best thinkers, And as I sometimes say, we locked them in a room for 5-day-long meetings. They weren't locked in, of course, but we did have these 5-day-long meetings that ultimately resulted in this document here, Materials Management in Oregon, the 2050 Vision and Framework for Action. It was adopted by our State Environmental Quality Commission at the end of 2012 after a planning process that took about 16 months in duration. Again, very short document with big font and lots of pictures. So if you have time, you might want to take a look at this. The 2050 Vision and Framework for Action, as the name implies, is a document with two parts, the vision and the framework. The vision itself is shown here: Oregonians in 2050 produce and use materials responsibly, conserving resources, protecting the environment, living well. This is our compass. This is what points us in the direction of the work what we're trying to achieve. And I'll mention that initially some of our stakeholders were pretty critical of us for using 2050. They challenged us. They said, how can you plan out to 2050? And we made it clear we're not planning to 2050. We're envisioning a future that we'd like to achieve. And because what we'd like to achieve, there's such a massive gap between where we are now and where we would like to be, we need enough time to realize the changes necessary to get us here. Also, the choice of 2050 proved to be a really good choice for us because effectively it's beyond the retirement date of anyone in the room and allowed some of our more anxious stakeholders to leave some of their concerns at the door and think about what's really in the best interest of our state, our society, and their grandchildren, as opposed to their short-term interests, particularly when it comes to money. So the process we used in this planning process was a process called backcasting, where you start with the end in mind. Many plans try to do something like this, but ultimately they really focus on understanding where they currently are and then saying, well, how do we move forward from where we currently are? In contrast to this with backcasting, this process of defining a vision is hugely important, and we spent probably more than half of the work group's time coming up with these, 15 or so words here. But once we had consensus and agreement and support for that vision, then we would say, okay, if that's where we want to be, what do I need to do today to achieve that vision? And that leads us to the framework for action, which is not an implementation plan, but rather a framework of some of the types of actions necessary to realize that vision. To be clear, we do not know how to achieve this vision, but we do know some of the steps that are required. And by analogy, this is a bit like planning to summit a mountain where part of the path is obscured by clouds or rocks. You don't quite know how you're going to get to the top, but you're going to gear up with the equipment you think you need, and you're going to start going uphill and exploring and trailblazing, and you'll try some routes that will be dead end, and you'll try some routes that will break through. The framework for action organizes the actions into four pathways: foundational work, policies and regulations, collaboration and partnerships, and education and information. And we believe we have to move down all four of those paths concurrently in order to realize this vision. After the vision was adopted, we took a big, deep breath and looked around and realized that we needed to start really by focusing on building a more solid foundation. Our program was funded by a per-ton fee on garbage disposal, and that fee had not been changed since 1991. It had never been adjusted for inflation, and when the Great Recession hit, our finances really went into a tailspin, deep cuts in our program. Our legislation foundational legislation had not seriously been updated for a long time, and our goals and measures were not aligned with the vision. So we went through another very large stakeholder process. An invite-only advisory group, 3 open subcommittees, 22 public meetings with these groups involving more than 100 stakeholders, plus a road show where we went around to almost every county in the state. And out of that process came 2 legislative concepts that were ultimately became bills in the 2015 session, Senate Bills 245 and 263. They were passed with decent bipartisan support. And just in summary, some of the key outcomes of this legislation. First, the legislation revised our authority and made it clear that our authority is not only to manage solid waste, but to, quote, reduce the environmental and human health impacts of materials at all stages of their life cycle, unquote. The legislation restored and stabilized our funding and created a mechanism to avoid the funding tailspin we had just gotten out of. It expanded our granting authority, gave us authority to issue a wider variety of grants to a wider variety of entities. A big section of this legislation revised and updated our state goals, updated our statewide waste recovery goal for all wastes as well as local goals. It established new statewide recovery goals for 3 materials that we identified through the WARM tool as having the greatest potential for energy and greenhouse gas reduction benefits if recovery could be increased, and those are food, plastics, and carpet. The bill requires us to start evaluating recovery rates not only denominated in tons of mass of material recovered, but also environmental outcomes such as energy savings. And the bill also strongly updated Oregon's waste generation goals. Again, those are the goals that lead us to focus on the reduce reuse part of reduce, reuse, recycle. The bill also changed Oregon's opportunity to recycle requirements. This is our framework legislation for recycling that requires cities and counties or their agents to provide a variety of recycling services. The menu of requirements was expanded to include waste prevention and reuse, so it's no longer just about recycling. Created some new requirements to address the growing problem of contamination, and it closed a loophole that was causing certain multi-tenant residents not to have access to convenient recycling opportunities. So that's the legislation in a nutshell, and sort of brings us to where we are today. We're starting to implement the legislation. But again, I will take a pause here to see if you have any questions or insights, perspectives you'd like to share on these topics. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Questions for David? Bear with me while I unmute everyone. This is a little laborious through the software. My apologies. Any questions, thoughts, or comments for David?
Yes, this is Kathy again from Vermont. In your state plan, what is your disposal rate goal?
Thanks, Kathy. The goal is not in the state plan. The goal is in statute.
Oh, really? Oh, what might that be?
And there is no explicit disposal rate goal. So let me explain how the Oregon system works in a bit more detail. When it comes to solid waste goals, we have 2 sets of goals. The first goal is a generation goal, and that goal is to reduce overall waste generation, which is defined as the sum of disposal and recovery. We have a pretty sophisticated material recovery survey here that we use every year to quantify the tons of material recovered. So that goal, is to reduce waste generation. Oh boy, I might get this wrong. I think it's 15% below 2012 levels by 2025 and 40% below 2012 levels by 2050. So that goal, if we achieve it, will reduce the overall amount of discards. And then within the universe of discards, we have a goal to recover via recycling, composting, and certain forms of energy recovery 52% of our discarded or generated materials by 2020 and 55% recovery by 2025 and subsequent years. So combined, if you do the math, these goals collectively would reduce our disposal by about 72% against this 2012 baseline, which ironically is very, very similar to California's goal of 75% reduction in disposal below a baseline. The big, really important difference here between California's approach and Oregon's is that California's approach is a single goal that focuses on disposal, and one can achieve that goal using any and all of the middle and upper tiers of the hierarchy. In Oregon's approach, we achieve the same disposal outcome, but if we can achieve our goals, the environmental benefit will be much, much higher. And the reason is because it will force us to focus on prevention and reuse first. And we all know that a ton of prevention and a ton of reuse environmentally are worth a lot more than a ton of recycling or a ton of composting. Now, we don't know if we can achieve these goals. They are exceptionally ambitious. But there is a very important distinction here, and I hope you appreciate that what we're trying to do with these two sets of goals is to work across the hierarchy with a focus on the top, which is why it's at the top of the hierarchy, and also improve recovery programs at the same time.
Excellent, thank you.
And Kathy, let me just add one other thing here. The reason we like the way we've framed these goals is not only do they reinforce the hierarchy, but they don't reinforce the solid waste view of the world. You know, disposal goals are really, let's just step back a moment and talk about goals kind of philosophically. Goals can be very, very powerful because goals signal to the public writ large what, as a society, we care about. And a goal to reduce solid waste disposal, from my perspective, emphasizes that we want to keep things out of landfill. Doesn't talk about conserving resources or reducing pollution. It's keeping stuff out of landfill. And that, in my experience, working with folks in the business community and talking with the general public, can lead to a couple of undesirable consequences. One of them is wishful recycling. When the public believes that landfills are inherently evil and should be avoided, then we get an increase in contamination. Materials that shouldn't be in the bin, but they figure, oh, it's better if I put it in this recycling bin than in this garbage bin. And we also really get a flattening of the hierarchy, or as one business owner once told me, he said, I was talking with his staff about prevention, about using less material, and he said, wait a minute, you want me to use less material? Hold on, buddy, I'm recycling stuff. I'm designing things so that it can be recycled, so that it can be kept out of the landfill. Isn't that what you want? And there are, you know, his confusion around this was sincere, but I would suggest there are folks in industry who are using recycling as a red herring to distract the public and policymakers from deeper, frankly, more important design considerations, or as the executive of a large beverage company once publicly said, our water bottles are recyclable, the problem has been solved.
Right, no, I hear what you're saying as far as that the benefit of reduction is far, far greater than that of recycling. One of the temptations, though, with looking at disposal is because our numbers are more accurate, because in order for us to estimate recycling, which you need to add to disposal to get your generation rate, is that the recycling numbers are what we call softer, because we don't get reports from all the materials that are recycled, so we have to use some pretty rough estimates. I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to improve that process.
Right. Well, again, it's a resource issue. So Oregon is fortunate in that back in 1991, when most of our foundational legislation was established, the state identified the benefits of having actual data on recycling. And so in our law, we have a recycling reporting requirement. It has a couple of exemptions. Scrap metal is the biggest one. Certain types of scrap metal, but everyone else who handles recyclable materials, whether they collect it, they process it, they have to report those quantities to us by material, by county of origin. And we have a system here. It requires something less than 1 FTE that collects that data and manages it in a way to avoid double counting and deal with allocation and mass balance. That gets us pretty good recycling and composting numbers. They're not surgically precise, but they're good enough. And again, that's a requirement in our state law. California is looking to implement something similar after 25 years in that state of not having recycling data and relying on disposal goals because disposal is the only good data they have. They've now realized they really need recycling data in order to make good decisions, and so they're following our path, I think.
Sure. And one last question, and then I'll stop. But we do have pretty good data recycling for our MRFs and certified facilities. What we don't have good numbers are like self-backhauling, like the big box stores that might take all their recyclable materials back to their headquarters. We don't have reporting of that. Is that something that Oregon does mandate reporting on?
Yes, we do.
Interesting.
Thank you. And just to be clear, that reporting, for the big box stores, we don't receive, 14 different reports from Home Depot. We get one report from Home Depot. They've got all this information, and it's a pretty simplified reporting burden. So the big box stores, the ones that are doing self-hauling, backhauling specifically, we do get reports from them. And there are probably some folks we're missing. I don't want to, make any claims that our system is entirely surgically precise and comprehensive. But again, it's a survey, not a census, but we think it gets us pretty robust numbers.
Thank you.
Great questions, Kathy. Other questions for David or comments? Anyone? And just a housekeeping note, if you're having any trouble weighing in and you're unable to unmute yourself or anything, please feel free to use the chat feature. Let me know and we can get you connected. So if there aren't other questions, we can move on to the next segment.
All righty, thank you. Okay, so what are we doing that's new or different as a result? I want to just point out that the focus here is going to be on what's new or different. But despite that, solid waste is still a very important part of our portfolio. There are public expectations, regulatory requirements, institutional history, ongoing needs, knowledge, and regulatory power. This is our bread and butter. We're not making any really significant changes on the portion of our work portfolio that addresses solid waste disposal or permitting. We're not contracting, we're not growing it, there's not a lot of changes there, it's a successful system, it works. So I'm just not going to talk anymore about that, other than to recognize it's an important part of our work, and it's sort of there in the background. So in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the recovery, prevention, and sustainable production and consumption side of the program. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to give you a quick tour, sort of a smorgasbord of sorts. If you want to dive deeper into any of these projects, we can do that during the Q&A or offline, or even in a separate webinar. I've offered to Andy and will offer to all of you that if there's a topic here you'd like to explore in more detail, I and my coworkers here would be happy to come back on another webinar and just dive deeper into one or more of these projects. So with that as an introduction, our work in recovery, recycling, and composting right now is focused primarily in 4 areas. One is reducing contamination. And as I mentioned, this new legislation in 2015 creates some new requirements for local governments regarding outreach that we're currently starting to implement. Expanded focus on multi-tenant. This is really challenging, but it's important. It's a growing portion of our population. As I identified earlier, plastics and food, as well as carpet, which is a little bit further out, were flagged as 3 top priority materials. So we have a couple projects looking to expand plastics collection, and we're in the middle of a planning process to figure out how to increase the recovery of food. And then, as I mentioned, these outcome-based recovery rates, we're starting to develop an algorithm and a system by which we can start evaluating recovery rates denominated not only in tons of mass, but also in environmental outcomes. And this, we think, is fairly significant because the current recovery system that Oregon has, where we count recovery tonnage, it is blind to the value of the recovery. That is, it treats a ton of recycling, a ton of composting, and a ton of energy recovery the same. It treats different materials the same. So a ton of composting a ton of yard debris is considered to be just as beneficial as recycling a ton of aluminum, even though the environmental impacts and benefits are vastly different. And even different in markets, glass to glass versus glass to aggregate, are all counted the same. And if the goal of recycling, and it is the goal of recycling in this state, is to conserve resources and reduce pollution, then we think we need to have metrics that help people understand how recovery reduces pollution and conserves resources. And that's what these outcome-based recovery rates will do. So we're just getting the algorithms for that built. It's gonna take a while, as you can imagine. It's pretty complex. We've made quicker progress on the prevention side of the equation, and I want to focus on a couple of projects. One is our recently published strategic plan for preventing the wasting of food. Now, I want to point out here why prevention is so important with a numeric example. Food waste comprises about 10% of all solid waste generated in Oregon. It's about 17% of our disposed stream and about 10% of what's generated. And of the food that's generated as waste, about 10% of that is currently recovered through composting or energy recovery. So we have a pretty low recovery rate currently. What I've done here for the sake of illustration is forecasted out to the year 2050. And I've assumed that per capita generation is constant, that the greenhouse gas intensities of production and consumption are the same, and that recovery rates remain fixed at about 10%. The only thing that's changed is Oregon's population. And as our population grows, we would expect the volumes of waste to grow as well. So here are the emissions over the life cycle that we would expect in 2050. And consider this to be a baseline case. Green are the emissions associated with growing, manufacturing, and transporting food that is ultimately wasted. Blue are the emissions from disposal, and that tiny red sliver over on the left are the emissions reductions associated with soil carbon storage, fertilizer displacement, and avoided utility emissions. Now, one of the reasons they look pretty small is that typically conversations around food waste focus on recovery, and they leave out the upstream emissions associated with growing and making the food in the first place. So most analyses that you or your staff have probably seen have shown just the blue and the red portions of the life cycle. But clearly, the upstream impacts of producing the food are important, very important. And when you add them into the equation, it shows you really how important they are. So what would this look like if we could achieve Oregon's new statutory recovery goal? We have a new goal in statute specific to food to recover 25% of our wasted food. This is how the emissions would change under this from the business as usual projection. The upstream emissions are the same. The disposal-related emissions would shrink. And the credits on the left for soil carbon storage and avoided fertilizer application and avoided utility emissions through anaerobic digestion would increase, and that would be a very good thing. But in contrast, what if we could achieve our new statutory waste generation goals? For the sake of illustration, I'm going to illustrate here a scenario where we achieve those goals for food waste through equal parts edible food rescue and pure prevention, that is wasting less food. Again, for illustration purposes, this is what we get from a greenhouse gas perspective. And most of the benefit here is from prevention, not rescue. Can we achieve these types of deep reductions in the wasting of food? Preliminary evidence suggests that perhaps we can. A DEQ-funded pilot project at 2 Intel corporate cafeterias a few years ago reduced post-consumer food waste by 47% through pure prevention, not rescue, not donation, not composting, but just wasting less food. At a national level, in the United Kingdom, the Love Food, Hate Waste program there reduced preventable food waste nationwide 21% in just the first 5 years of its programs. And prevention may be the key to unlocking deep business potential. An analysis published this spring that evaluated food loss reduction efforts at 1,200 business sites in 17 different countries found that nearly all businesses, 98% of them, had a positive return on their investment. And half of the businesses yielded more than a 14-fold ROI for every $1 invested in measuring waste, training staff, improving inventory management, and changing packaging in order to prevent the wasting of food. So in thinking about how we could meet our objective and as a basis for selecting priority projects for the next 5 years, we established 3 high-level goals for our work, and I've shown them here: develop the state of knowledge, increase business and consumer actions, and reduce a variety of environmental impacts aligned with our state statutory waste generation goals. Our near-term work, as that strategy was just adopted this spring, focuses on some foundational research. We're doing a major measurement study to understand how much food is wasted and why. And this is very important for ongoing work. We're doing some messaging research to better understand how to communicate to the public in a way that will help them to really follow the hierarchy. There's some somewhat unsettling evidence that waste recovery programs for food, if promoted in the wrong way, can really undermine prevention and lead to an increase in the wasting of food with large environmental impacts. So we need to figure out how to crack that nut. We're developing some campaigns. We're tracking some date labeling action at the national level. And we're also doing some foundational research on different food rescue approaches, because not all food rescue is the same. So that's a quick look at our strategy to prevent the wasting of food. For something entirely different, but still related to food, and entirely upstream in the sustainable production and consumption space, our next project here is a study that is simply reviewing existing LCA literature. There's no original modeling here. But here's the motivation for this study. There's a lot of food producers, food manufacturers, and large institutional purchasers of food that are wanting to do the right thing for the environment. But what is the right thing? And typically, if you're a corporate sustainability coordinator, it's pretty easy to come up, using Google with a list of 78 different sustainability actions you could take. But which ones are more important and which ones are less important? And how do you know? Well, this is where life cycle assessment can potentially be a useful tool by demonstrating where in the life cycle the big impacts occur. So if you're a manufacturer of applesauce and you want to reduce the carbon footprint of the applesauce, should you focus on the packaging? Is that where the impact is? Or is it the refrigeration? Or is it the lids? Or is it your own manufacturing facility? Or is it how far the apples are transported? Or is it whether or not they're grown with pesticides? I mean, what is it that really drives these environmental impacts? Where are the hot spots? Academic researchers have studied this extensively, but unfortunately, most of the academic research has not been communicated in a way that's easy to understand for small and medium-sized enterprises. So what we're doing in this project is we hired the University of Michigan to conduct a literature review of 9 different topics related to the environmental impacts of food over their life cycle. And then we're producing summaries, which should be published next month, on these 9 different topics. Hopefully, they will help both producers and large purchasers make better informed decisions. We don't know, but that's our hypothesis. But that's an example of some new work we're doing that has nothing to do with solid waste. A related project deals with product environmental footprints of concrete. We have a partnership with the a new partnership with the Oregon Concrete and Aggregate Producers Association. And in this project, we are helping any concrete producer in Oregon measure and disclose the environmental impacts of their different concrete mixes through environmental product declarations, also known as EPDs. EPDs are a third-party verified eco-label that can help inform both production and purchasing decisions. They're like the nutrition facts on your cereal box. Like food nutrition labels, EPDs help distinguish one product from another and give both the producer and the consumer considerably more information about their choices. Now, why concrete? Concrete is a product that has a really significant carbon footprint. And it's a carbon footprint that's really easy to reduce by substituting cement with fly ash, steel slag, or some other alternative cementitious materials. Institutional purchasers and people who are building under the new LEED version 4 green building rating system, which gives points for products that have EPDs, would like to have low carbon concrete. But any one concrete producer at one plant might produce 300 different mixes of concrete. And how do you know whether or not mix A is lower carbon footprint or lower environmental impact than mix B? This is where EPDs come in. By creating a system that makes it really easy for concrete producers to rapidly evaluate all their different concrete mixes and produce these EPDs, and further then, we're also reimbursing a portion of the cost of verifying their EPDs, which is surprisingly inexpensive. We're allowing for the creation of a market whereby purchasers can say, I want a concrete mix that has an EPD so that I can know whether or not it's reducing impacts, and producers can easily comply with that request. So that's how that project is working. Again, a pilot project just got started. Stay tuned for results. The next project I'll briefly mention involves another strategic planning effort that we completed last December, involving reuse, repair, and extending the lifespan of products. We spent several months reviewing literature and interviewing subject matter experts. We produced a background paper that had over 100 options for potential state programs or policies. You might want to check that out if you're looking to work in this space. We engaged a stakeholder advisory group and ultimately produced a strategic plan that focuses on three specific material types: clothing, building materials, and products that can be remanufactured. The entire strategic plan is a very short read. I think it's like 8 pages or something. You can find it on our website. One example of early implementation: the city of Portland recently passed an ordinance that prohibits the mechanical demolition of any single-family home built prior to 1917. The only viable option now to take down such an old home is deconstruction. However, the Portland area does, or historically has not had, a sufficiently trained workforce to handle all of this new deconstruction work. So the city and the deconstruction industry started a workforce development program to bring about 20 more people into this field, a combination of classroom and on-the-job training, and DEQ funded a portion of that workforce development program. So that's one example. Also this summer, we will be issuing our first ever micro grants to support workforce development in the reuse and repair industries, and also through our mainstream larger materials management grants program, we've been supporting a large number of reuse projects across the state: building materials, furniture, computers, etc. We have some upcoming projects we haven't started yet, but will be coming soon, regarding textiles and the textile system, whole building reuse versus replacement, and comparing the environmental impacts of demolition versus deconstruction, with a particular focus on lead and lead dust dispersion. couple other projects that are also just getting started. This next one involves researching and sharing with businesses information on popular attributes. We're all familiar with product marketing promoting popular attributes such as recyclable, compostable, biodegradable, bio-based, and general planet friendliness. These are aspects of a product's material composition that communicate desirable qualities that we think we want. But unfortunately, there's a bunch of evidence that suggests that these attributes do not consistently correlate with reductions in environmental impacts. We know of a number of examples, and I shared some with you earlier. So making consumption, production, or policy choices this way could actually be increasing environmental impacts. The research we're now commissioning is investigating different combinations of materials and attributes to see if we can identify under what circumstances do these attributes lead to environmental benefits, and under what circumstances do they lead to environmental detriments, and under what circumstances of attribute material combinations is it a total wash, in which, it's sort of like using a Ouija board or throwing darts. I mean, it's totally random. And this research should be completed by the end of the year. We hope to have some communication materials on it early next year. I'm just going to go through the rest of these slides very quickly here. We have some additional projects trying to support sustainable materials management production with businesses. In 2 weeks, we'll have our first ever sustainable procurement specialist. This is an area where Oregon really is a bit of a laggard, especially, for example, compared to Massachusetts or New York or some other states that have very robust environmentally preferable purchasing programs. But this new position will be working closely, partially embedded with our State Department of Administrative Services to serve as a subject matter expert in the development of technical specifications and evaluation criteria for environmentally preferable products and services. Many local governments here buy into these statewide price agreements, so this work will help local governments as well. And the last project that I'll mention is our consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Oregon, like I suspect most, probably all of the Northeast states, inventories its greenhouse gas emissions every year. And these inventories are very important because they're used to identify the sources of emissions and, by extension, opportunities to reduce emissions. And inventories also show change over time. Oregon is somewhat different in that we conduct a greenhouse gas inventory that has two different lenses. The first, which is what most states use exclusively, is an accounting of emissions inside the state with an adjustment for imported and exported electricity. But the second lens, called the consumption-based emissions inventory, is an estimate of the worldwide emissions that result from Oregon's consumption. The materials management program where I work contributes to the in-boundary inventory, and we lead the second consumption-based approach, in part because it really shines a light on the life cycle emissions associated with materials. For example, in 2014, 44% of our consumption-based emissions resulted from the consumption of materials, more than the direct consumption of fuels and electricity combined. The effort to update this inventory is not small, so we only do a full update once every 5 years, 2005 and 2010. And just this week, I'm starting in earnest the full sort of gold standard once every 5 years update to do the 2015 consumption-based emissions inventory. Much of the original work on this, I'll mention, was done by consultants in the northeastern states, I'd add. And I'll also mention that one of the outcomes of this work is a new strategy we're just getting started on around sustainable consumption. I don't have a lot of specifics to share. I can talk a little bit more about it if you'd like. So that's a flavor of our new work. Again, I haven't described every single project, but it should give you a sense of our direction. Traditional waste recovery, along with solid waste facility permitting and oversight, is still an important part of our work, and we're maintaining, even slightly increasing, our investment in those areas. But we're putting more emphasis on the reduce, reuse part of reduce, reuse, recycle, as well as trying several new approaches that have little or nothing to do with solid waste at all, and which squarely and entirely live in the realm of sustainable production and consumption. This is frontier work. If you're doing similar work or you're interested in it, we'd love to get together offline and compare notes. So please do reach out to me or my colleagues. My email address is shown here.